Welcome to the third lecture of the lecture series, Psychology of Well-Being. Well, we are going to look at, in this lecture, history, definitions, and perspectives of well-being, and how a paradigmatic overview helps in binding together many of these definitions and perspectives of well-being. So, as we had seen in lecture 1 and 2, that it's important to begin with the lived realities of a majority of citizens of the world and India, their sense of well-being or their struggles for well-being. It becomes important then to also look at how, or rather whether or not, the literature or the concepts or definitions or theories or perspectives of well-being have some parallel or have some ways of touching those lived realities of people's well-being or not. So that's where this third lecture becomes very important. So what all we are going to do in this particular lecture, what all we are going to discuss. First, the brief history of psychological study of well-being, followed by having good life as well-being, and that's being the consensual definition of it. Well, the perspectives and paradigms of well-being. The positivist paradigm we'll be looking at, and how the hedonic and eudaimonic approaches, I beg your pardon, there is some typographical error here. Eudaimonic spelling is Eudaimonic. Eudaimonic approaches. So that will be covered. That will see that how positivist paradigm or the natural science paradigm has its parallel with these approaches. Then the constructionist paradigm or social constructionist paradigm has its parallels with the contextual or cultural approaches. And the critical theory paradigm has its way of binding together or have its parallel with the social justice approach towards well-being. All right, so let's look at the brief history of psychological study of well-being. What does it say? Well, well-being, whether understood as good life or happiness, has been a major implicit or explicit goal of a human being, presumably since early human civilization. One can imagine, one can presume that yes, any human being for that matter needs to have not only good physical health but also has some goal of reaching out to a sense of having good life or happiness. This also gets reflected in the wisdom of philosophers or saints, excuse me, such as Aristotle and Lord Buddha. All right, so what Aristotle has to say now, we find that 384 to 322 um, before current era or before Christ. Through the concept of eudaimonia, Aristotle highlighted how important it was for a person to be true to one's inner self or daemon in order to live a meaningful life. When we come back to Buddha, who um, it is believed that who lived around the same time, maybe 1 century earlier than Aristotle. Now, he posited that to be at peace with oneself is to be at peace with the world, and to be at peace with the world is to make the world a more peaceful place. Now, for him, or for Lord Buddha, each of us in turn, each element of the search for well-being constitutes a part of the whole in much the same way that we, in our short lifespans, are just one part of a much larger, ever-expanding universe. Respect for life and existence in all of its forms is essential to the attainment of true inner peace and harmony. Now, again, that reminds us about even in, let us say, around 2500 or 400 years ago, Lord Buddha talked about um, peace of mind, inner peace, harmony, And Aristotle talked about, again, being true to one's own inner self for a meaningful life. So, in some ways, uh, well-being has been a concern amongst thinkers, the philosophers, or saints like Aristotle and Lord Buddha. Well, we come to the modern era. Around mid-20th century, humanistic theories focusing on the study of positive human functioning came to the fore. A famous example, if we have done some courses, introductory courses in psychology, we would recall that there is this famous theory of self-actualization, which is to realize one's real self as one major motivation, inner motivation in a person's life. One tends to grow towards realizing one's true or real self. And that is something which has been a concern since mid 20th century, exemplified in the works of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers also. Well, around the same time, Mary Jehuda's contribution in the form of a book called Current Concepts of Positive Mental Health, that was published in 1958, emphasized a new approach to mental health, conceptualized as not only absence of illness but also as presence of positive approach to life, which means attitudes towards the self, development of self-actualization, integration of psychological functions, autonomy, accurate perception of reality, and environmental mastery. So not only the absence of illness, but also presence of positive approach to life that has been pointed out 1958 by Mary Jehuda's contribution. Well, around the same time, a decade earlier, the World Health Organization also recognized that health needs to be understood as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not only the absence of illness or dysfunction. So we find that uh, the the move towards promoting well-being or good life for people started becoming very clear even within the theorization and research within psychology and social science. And then we find that since 1970s, the interest of psychologists and social scientists in positive and optimal functioning or happiness and well-being has become prominent, as these are taken to be desirable states of the human condition. Well, how about an overall or unified definition of well-being? Let us see how having good life has become an important concern amongst many reviewers who have seen that this is how, or rather, having good life has been conceptualized implicitly or explicitly as the nature of well-being. So the reviewers have pointed out that there is a bit of consensus regarding having a unified definition in terms of having good life as far as well-being, human well-being goes. So several reviewers, they have noted there is no single unified definition of well-being, and they have also noted that well-being in the modern times has become complex to define because A, there has been differences in points of view about its nature, and B, multiple aspects of it that required one's attention. So perhaps um, because of both these reasons, it has been difficult to define. Many of the social scientists have found this complexity to be really instrumental in having the difficulty to have a unified definition of well-being. So different points of view about its nature and multiple aspects of well-being that requires people's attention. So unified definition becomes a bit difficult. Well, despite that, there is a growing consensus among the experts in psychology who have conducted systematic reviews of theories of well-being, and it is about promoting good life among people. So let's take one example. Following is an example of assumptions about promoting good life. Well, hedonic, which means happiness or pleasure from fulfillment of desires, and eudaimonic, which means optimal psychological functioning. Now, these assumptions underlie several psychological and other social science theories of well-being. Subjective well-being has been based substantially on hedonic and psychological well-being. These are two very popular theories of well-being, subjective well-being and psychological well-being. And psychological well-being is based on the eudaimonic assumptions, which is about having optimal psychological functioning. Now we bring in one new term here, which is paradigms, right? So perspective and paradigms of well-being, drawing a parallel. Well, uh, it's interesting that evolution of the perspectives or theories of well-being has a parallel with scientific paradigms that have been adopted in the discipline. It will be clearer to us very soon what do we mean by scientific paradigms. Initially, as psychology and social science were influenced by natural science, the natural science or positivist paradigm, formed the foundation of theorizing about various kinds of topics like well-being. As the social or cultural context gained importance during 1960s and 70s, in research and in theorizing, social constructionist paradigm became important that focuses on how realities are shaped within social or cultural context. And recently, social justice issues have been taken up using critical theory paradigm that takes up the empowerment of people, particularly those who have been marginalized, rather than just understanding their realities, right? It also it also tends to focus on changing their uh, realities towards empowerment. So that has been taken up. That has taken up the social justice issues within well-being, something that we have been talking about in lecture 1 and 2. Now, with the help of some examples, let's see in this lecture uh, perspectives of well-being, right? With the help of paradigmatic assumptions that form their foundations. Now, before we go into how various paradigms formed a coherent theoretical structure to understand various theories or which bound together various theories or perspectives on well-being, let's understand more closely what is a paradigm all about. Well, a paradigm of social science is structured by the answers it provides to number one, ontology. What do you mean by ontology? Assumptions about the nature of reality being studied. B, epistemology. Nature of relationship between the knower or the researcher and the knowable or the participant. And methodology, the ways of attaining knowledge. And then finally, axiology, the purpose the research and its findings may serve to the participants. So, depending upon how these four questions of ontology, epistemology, methodology, and axiology are answered, we have a variety of paradigms. Let's begin with the first, and that is natural science that we are familiar with in general since our childhood, or it's also known as a positivist paradigm. And what are its basic assumptions? So we'll take help of those four broader questions of ontology, epistemology, methodology, and axiology to understand the basic assumptions of these paradigms. And let's begin with understanding the positivist paradigm. So ontology for positivist paradigm is that reality exists out there to be discovered towards developing universal or universally generalizable laws or theories. And what is epistemological assumption? Distanced or hierarchical relationship between the knower and the knowable. And methodology, experimentation or survey with the help of neutral observation or data collection procedures using variables about the phenomenon under study. So primarily looking at the relationship amongst various variables that tend to signify or tend to represent various kinds of phenomena that we are interested in studying scientifically. So that's the methodology. And axiology. So that's the purpose that the research or its finding would serve to the research participants. That's generally decided by a researcher on the basis of existing literature and proposed research. Well, if it is becoming a bit abstract, the understanding of paradigm, let's take examples to try and make it more lively and understandable. So positivist paradigm will try to take the examples of hedonic and eudaimonic approaches to well-being. Well, hedonic and eudaimonic approaches in mainstream psychology that we learned about above are typical examples of conceptualizing or researching well-being using positivist or natural science paradigm. Subjective well-being, experience of positive reactions to one's life, and life satisfaction. And psychological well-being is understood as being able to exercise one's potential towards optimal psychological functioning, and that comes again way back in 1984 and 89 respectively, as we talk about subjective well-being and psychological well-being. So we find that how natural science paradigm uh, tend to guide, or the positivist paradigm, it guided the work in these areas of understanding well-being. So what are the strengths or contributions of the variable-based methodology or positivist paradigm that in general has been adopted in psychological well-being and subjective well-being in theorizing and researching about human well-being? So let's take one clear example of it. And we'll be looking at the example of a comparison of indices of life satisfaction or subjective well-being across GDPs of various countries. Now, GDPs is again, GDP is defined as the annual income of a particular country divided by the population, which basically means that on average, what is the income, what is the annual income of a person or a citizen of a particular country. And if it is high or low, if it is $1,000 or less than that per year, the average income for a person, or if it is let us say $40,000 US dollars, how does it modulate the life satisfaction or well-being of its citizens? And we'll be having data from several dozen countries, from World Bank, and some researchers have tried to put it together for us. So let's take a look at this particular study, which talks about the two variables, subjective well-being or life satisfaction, and the second variable, GDPs of various countries. And if we want to see a relationship between these two, it basically falls under the study within positivist or the natural science paradigm that focuses on, again, as we have noted, variables and the relations between the relation amongst those variables. So more closely. So here is the data on x-axis. We find GDP per capita, which means that, again, as I said, per person, what is the annual income? And we have the range from um, something like a few $100 highlighted in Madagascar. If we look at the top left corner of the screen, Haiti, South Sudan, to Luxembourg, which has more than $90,000 GDP per capita, average income of a citizen annually or in a year. And we find that once we look at the y-axis, we have got the percentage of people who were surveyed who were dissatisfied with the standard of living. So those who said that they are not satisfied. So it ranges from uh, 0% of people to 80% of people. For example, if we look at Madagascar, it has almost about 80% of people who have set, as the data could estimate, that more than, I beg your pardon, around 80% of people reported to be satisfied, to be dissatisfied, I beg your pardon, with standard of living. So that's where subjective well-being on y-axis in terms of satisfaction or a lack of it, and on x-axis GDP per capita comes in. And let's look at what inference can be drawn from here. Now, as these scholars, Roser and Ortiz Ospina, observed, the first observation is, let's focus on this, subjective well-being or satisfaction with living standards among citizens does not improve across nations in general drastically with average income or GDP per capita, which is annual income of the country divided by population. A majority of countries with GDP less than $40,000 have how many dissatisfied people? More than 20% of population are dissatisfied for a majority of countries with GDP less than $40,000. So again, whether it is 1,000, 10,000, 20,000, up to 40,000 US dollar GDP per capita, we find that the number of dissatisfied people across these countries, which can be covered with this red rectangle, have more than 20% of population being dissatisfied with the living standards. So that's the first uh, conclusion, or that's the first observation, where it has to be seen that uh, the satisfaction among citizens does not improve drastically with average income. So we need to think in terms of not just increasing income, but also something else. Because even if you increase income up to $40,000, there are majority of citizens of the world's countries, we find that more than 20% of population being dissatisfied. And what is the second observation? In countries with very low GDP or those which are very poor countries, dissatisfaction level is very high. So we find that again, these poor countries reflected in the top left blue dotted square, right from Madagascar and coming down to Palestine, where the GDP per capita is less than $10,000, or maybe it is close to something like some $1,000 only. We find that dissatisfaction is very high. It's something like above 40% and ranges up to 80% of their population being dissatisfied with the living standards. It also leaves some other questions that um, what are the, besides the GDP or the economic criteria, what are the other important aspects of their lives which makes them dissatisfied? As the first observation points out, that even if you increase the GDP per capita, more than 20% of population are dissatisfied. Now, it's important that we need some other paradigms also besides this particular paradigm of uh, social science or psychological science, which helps us understand the reality of well-being in terms of various variables and the relationships amongst them. And here we saw the relationship between GDP per capita and subjective well-being. So let's move on to other paradigms that will help us understand the context or the social justice issues that might be related to the well-being of people. Well, now the social constructionist paradigm, what are the basic assumptions? Now, it will tell us that reality is taken to be socially constructed, that's the ontology. Multiple facets of phenomena are comprehended using multiple sets of data as well as interpretations. And epistemology is that empathic relationship between the researcher and the participant. And methodology, joint constructions of meanings between researchers and researched by creating space for the participants to voice their concerns and lived experiences. And axiology using, I beg your pardon, usually decided in collaboration with participant aiming at empowerment or emancipation from forces, particularly popular and academic cultural discourses that deny participant their voice. So recall that axiology was all about the purpose of research and its finding for the research participants, and we find that it's decided in collaboration with the participants. One example that how contextual cultural approaches to well-being can be studied with the help of social constructionist paradigm. And let's recall that contextual or cultural approaches tend to tell us that we get close to the participants' realities rather than using the popular or academic discourses around what well-being is. So rather than going, let us say, top-down approach, as we saw in case of the relationship between subjective well-being and GDP per capita under positivist paradigm, we go bottom up in terms of understanding people's own voices and concerns regarding well-being. So it's my own study published in 2015 where I undertook at Sonachura village of Nandigram block in West Bengal, where state government wanted to construct a chemical hub under the lauded scheme of creating special economic zone despite the resistance from the local villagers. For popular or academic discourses, SEZs or special economic zones might be facilitating well-being inducing development. So that's the popular discourse about development and well-being. But as I pointed out, in the name of development, the long-lasting interpersonal I beg your pardon, long-standing interpersonal and community bonds are severed by the state government policies. Well, I also conducted a semi-structured interview for this particular study, and the example is that of one participant. These are pseudonyms or false names used in this particular study for the participants because of ethical reasons. A 45-year-old farmer was carrying a serious, excuse me. So Shekhar was carrying a serious injury after he faced the bullets from the cadre of ruling political party and the police during a protest villagers were holding against the land acquisition by the state government on 10th November 2007. He had numbness in his right leg after he was operated on for the bullet injury incurred near his waist. He had tears in his eyes as he narrated the experience of nearly dying due to the gunshot. He, however, was not concerned about his personal injury and losses. He mentioned his deep shock over the fact that the assailant was from his own village and who shared an environment of trust and togetherness. Besides this shock, there was a sense of insecurity and danger for his life since their own people had betrayed them for petty political gains, he shared. The man who shot at me has fled to Gujarat with his family. The villagers in general have peace of mind, but they still fear that the villagers affiliated to CPM party or the ruling party may attack them once again. Besides a sense of betrayal by their fellow villagers, he also expressed a sense of distress associated with being betrayed by the very government that apparently stood for villagers' concerns over and above the industrialization of the state. Our way of life is entirely different from urban life in that we are entirely dependent on agriculture. While planning the chemical hub, the government cared little about our agriculture-based life. So that's the betrayal that he's talking about. So again, I'll summarize that rather than focusing on the assumed development um, inducing policies that would take care of well-being, it's important to look at how the challenges of well-being, challenges to having a sense of well-being was being experienced by these villagers, and that has to be taken into account when we are able to focus at the context of their lives. That's what social constructionist paradigm talks about, that rather than looking at popular or academic concepts alone or focusing on that from a top-down approach, let's go the bottom-up approach. So that was social constructionist paradigm, and that takes care of contextual and cultural understanding of well-being. Now we move on to the final one, that is critical theory paradigm. And what are the basic assumptions? These are very close to the social constructionist paradigm, but there is some sort of difference in ontology. Now they say that the critical theory paradigm adherents, the reality shaped within a socio-historical context where cultural, political, and gender-based dynamics pivotally shape the worldview or experiences of people. So rather than just the context, they talk about the whole hierarchical context in which lives are lived. Epistemology, empathic relationship between the researcher and the participant. Methodology, again, joint constructions of meanings between the researcher and the researched by creating spaces for participants to voice their concerns and lived experiences. And in axiology, it's usually decided in collaboration. And again, axiology, the purpose that the research and its findings serves for the participants, that's usually decided in collaboration with the participants themselves, aiming at empowerment or emancipation from forces which are structural, policy-related, or socio-political in nature that deny participants their voice. So let's take one example that how social justice approach can be taken up with the help of this empowerment-focused critical theory paradigm. For this, we move on to Kruger and Lawrence study, who noted how gender roles and new liberal discourses created in the mothers of low-income families of South Africa a feeling of being deficient. Now, let us recall the whole meaning of new liberal discourses, how that might be influential for these families too. The images of being an efficient or an ideal mother are related to the discourses of neoliberalism in this particular set of participants or of low-income families in South Africa. And it tends to commodify their social, relational, and personal life as well as skills. We are going to take that as an example that uh, how neoliberalism or the new liberal context that has shaped their social, personal life by commodifying it, by looking at it in terms of how they are able to contribute to productivity or not, and what kind of personal responsibility that are sort of thrusted upon these mothers, whether they like it or not. So mothers are socialized into these discourses, and the individual responsibility. Now this is very important. Let's focus on this. Mothers are socialized into such discourses, and the individual responsibility, I would emphasize, of care of child is placed primarily on the mother in this new liberal socio-economic context. As the authors have observed, the internalized notions of being a mother was to be an all-providing, ever-giving, self-sacrificing mother, an ideal that women could not live up to. The participants narrated the experience of guilt as well as the feeling of being a deficient person as they took the entire burden of caring and providing food for the children on. One such participant shared, slowly she moved her head in thought and she said, "Yes, like the whole situation, the whole problem I take on me because I think if things were perhaps different, if I perhaps could work and all the things, then then we won't have stayed in such a place. Then it would not have been so hard for my children and they would not be hungry. So I blame myself. Most of the time, I blame myself for my circumstances, my situation, and that makes it difficult for me. It makes me feel very, very inferior. It makes me feel as if I'm a zero, a zero. I don't exist, a zero. I'm a nothing, yes. This makes me feel very, very inferior. And if I sometimes sit still and think I don't perhaps have what my two sisters have or so, and I have the tendency to say I am a nothing because I don't have anything in life. Tear starts to show and voice tremble. That is how it feels to me right now. She wipes her eyes with the tissue. So that's the new liberal context and how touching such uh, challenges to these mothers' well-being who feel the brunt of commodification of their life and their roles or gender roles in terms of what they are able to provide or whether they are productive or not in taking care of their family and children. So that becomes possible to be studied with the help of critical theory paradigm that focuses on touching the possibilities of empowerment from their marginalized situation with the help of uh, focus on social justice issues of empowerment. So finally, with the help of the examples of some perspectives, contextual, cultural, injustice-based theories, hedonic and eudaimonic of well-being, we could clearly see how, when situated within paradigms, these may help us develop a coherent understanding of well-being. Therefore, in the next three lectures, lectures 4 to 6, we will elaborate further on different types of perspectives or theories of well-being that will help understand their relationship with different paradigms. I apologize again, there is some typo there with the help of their relationship with different paradigms.